Hi everybody, it's Marnie W. It's March 23rd and I'm bringing our classes to you this week through PowerPoint videos. This week's are divided into two. We've got part 1 and part 2. After this one, part 2 will come along fairly quickly. So this week our topic was supposed to be tolerance and well-being, and I'd encourage you to still read these articles, but given the global crisis that we're all confronting, we're going to shift our focus a bit for this week's classes, and instead we're going to look at some of the factors that are connected to the cultivation of resilience. But before we do that, I want to take a little bit of a look at where we were supposed to go last week with our examination of creativity. And you'll recall we saw Sir Ken Robinson's TED Talk, Do Schools Kill Creativity? And after that, we got divided into groups, and I asked you to look at several questions, and those questions were all about creativity and its relationship to resilience and well-being. So the first set of questions was, what is creativity? What are some indicators or signs of creativity? What are some potential benefits of creativity? And how does society demonstrate whether creativity is valued or not? So we were looking at creativity just generally speaking. Then we moved on to these two questions. What does creativity have to do with resilience? And what does creativity have to do with well-being? And so these questions were really about moving us away from creativity as being something that we commonly associate with the arts, broadly speaking, because creativity extends way beyond the arts. It really is about figuring things out. It's about problem solving. It's about determining what you need to make a go of it, especially in times of extraordinary challenge. And it's a bit about figuring out what you need to help you adapt. So that was what we were doing when we were going to look at our examination of creativity. As I said about the stuff on tolerance and well-being, I'd encourage you to read the Sir Ken readings. He's an awesome guy, as you saw in the TED Talk. The readings, I think, are quite interesting, and certainly at this point, when we're dealing with the crisis that's going on in the world right now, being able to be creative is going to be really key. Okay, so for this week, we're going to look at some of the psychosocial factors of facets of resilience, and we're going to do so through this article, this 2014 article. And you'll note that a lot of the stuff that's on the lecture slides is taken directly from this article. Some of the more sort of key salient points. First of all, let's look at this idea of trauma and the fact that it comes in many forms, and people's reactions to trauma vary. So trauma could be trauma, stress, adversity. We're going to call it a range of things, but for the sake of this argument here today, we're looking at this notion of trauma, and this idea again that it comes in a whole lot of different packages, and the responses to it are varied. Now, this is not new. We've talked about this a fair bit in this course. It definitely is key to some of the stuff we've looked at around resilience and stress. So this concept of the range of traumatic experiences shouldn't be new to you. In most cases, though, traumatic experience does not actually lead to something which would be considered to be a mental illness. So that being post-traumatic stress disorder. Also, the outside of the world of mental illness is known post-traumatic stress injury, the less sort of medicalized version of that. So one study suggested that the risk of actually developing PTSD after a traumatic event was approximately 9%, which is not all that big, really. Some individuals have a remarkable ability to endure and recover from absolutely unfathomable stress, torture, trauma, or disaster. Others not so much. So where resilience as a psychosocial construct is concerned, generally we're looking at this idea of adaptive characteristics. And the adaptive characteristics of an individual is really about their ability to cope and recover from, and hopefully even thrive after some kind of an adverse event or a series of adverse events. And in this particular context that we're looking at here, we're looking at psychosocial factors that contribute to resilience after traumatic experience, and we're looking at these within three primary areas: cognitive, behavioral, and existential. The cognitive components are people's patterns of thinking or their core beliefs. And we've talked earlier in this course as well about this notion of the core narrative, right? In that early time in our lives when some of our core beliefs or the core narrative is really set for us. It's established through experiences that happen in those prime developmental years. So this would be the cognitive components. Not surprisingly, the behavior components are about action. It's what we do in response to what's going on around us or what's happening in our world. And the existential components are a little bit more abstract. And really, this is about one's sense of his or her existence and their purpose or sense of meaning and sense of being able to create or find meaning and purpose in the world. This little screenshot is a table from the article, and it really is a nice example of how they've divided up the cognitive, behavioral, and existential components. For instance, if we're looking at optimism, it's primarily a cognitive component, and really it's about maintaining positive expectancies for the future. Whereas we look at physical health, that's primarily a behavioral component. Now, that might include things like physical activity and exercise or maintaining a social support network. The moral compass, the personal moral compass, is primarily an existential component, and that might be really about having faith, having spirituality, not feeling isolated or alone in one's life, and having meaning and purpose. And you can see there's a bit of a crossover. For instance, active coping skills versus passive would be the cognitive realm. There would be about minimizing the continued threat of appraisal, and it might involve actively seeking help and resources. So psychosocial factors that promote resilience and ultimately well-being, again, are divided into cognitive, behavioral, and existential components. Within there, one of the primary cognitive components is optimism. So there's a lot of talk about being optimistic, being hopeful, and this really refers to the maintenance of positive expectancies for an important future outcome. Right, so this is what people are thinking. It's their perception. This is conceptualized as a personality dimension, and it's likely more of a trait than a state or a characteristic. Somebody's degree of optimism can be observed to shift over time or across situations. So optimism is not a static state. It's not a static perception or a static experience. It ebbs and it flows, and it's going to ebb and flow in response to and in relation to a lot of the things that are going on around an individual and how the things that are going on around that individual are interacting with what's going on within that individual, right? So capacity to respond, capacity to cope, perceptual analysis of what's happening, all of these sorts of things are going to contribute to this shift, this ebb and flow of how optimistic somebody is able to be over time. Then there's this other notion of cognitive flexibility, and it's important to note here that optimism on its own doesn't usually enable resilience. So certainly it's key, but on its own, nice to have, but it's not necessarily going to take us all the way to resilience. Cognitive flexibility is about the ability to reappraise your perception and experience of a traumatic situation instead of being rigid in that perception. So this is a key idea. Sometimes we get fixed ideas, fixed beliefs, and we just want to cling to those. And that tendency tends to ramp up and become even greater within most of us the more stressed we are, the more we sort of cling to our perceptions, cling to our beliefs. And really, although tempting and although it's our tendency, it's really not productive. So cognitive flexibility is key. And really, again, it's important to stress that this is really about being able to reappraise our perceptions and our experience of the trauma that's going on around us, and resist that temptation to stay rigidly stuck, to sort of hold our perceptions tightly and not be able to be, not have any fluidity with those, right? Cognitive flexibility can also involve an effort to find meaning and positive outcomes, as well as acknowledging the negative and painful consequences. So this can be a little bit of an interesting scenario for people where we're trying to sort of create a sense of meaning, create a sense of purpose, create a sense of belief in a positive outcome, at the same time as being realistic about what's happening, is not sort of glossing over or getting into the cloud of avoidance and denial around what's actually happening. So being, in some cases, brutally honest about the potential for negative and painful consequences, but at the same time saying to ourselves, can I rise up? Can I reappraise my perceptions such that I can create and or find and or create some kind of meaning, some kind of sense of there is going to be some kind of a positive outcome. Traumatic experiences can be reevaluated, and this reevaluation can alter the perceived value and meaningfulness of the event. And this is absolutely key, and it relates to what we just covered in this last slide, is that our capacity to be resilient, our capacity to sort of rise up and above something that's going on around us that is quite traumatic for us, really does depend on our ability to reframe and have a different relationship with what's happening. So if we can learn to reframe our thoughts about a traumatic event, if we can assimilate these thoughts into our memory and our beliefs, if we can make it sort of go beyond an intellectual experience to say, yes, I really believe this, then we might be able to accept and eventually recover from what's going on. And if we look at, that 9% that might fall into the place where they end up with a post-traumatic stress response or post-traumatic stress disorder response to an event, this is going to be key to avoiding that outcome, right? This idea of reframing thoughts about the traumatic event, assimilating that reframed ideal into our own sort of set of beliefs so that it goes from being an intellectual exercise to being an actual reality for us. And that in itself is going to be key to helping us to sort of accept something and then eventually recover from the effects of it. So we take optimism, we take cognitive flexibility, we combine them. This allows a person to maintain a sense of faith that they will prevail or survive regardless of the difficulties at hand. This enables us to confront and accept the brutal facts of the current reality. And this is actually called the Stockdale paradox. It was named after a guy whose last name was Stockdale, and he was apparently very high up in the American military, and he was a prisoner of war in Vietnam, and he noticed that those around him who were not surviving, who were succumbing to what was going on, were the ones that didn't have this combination of optimism and cognitive flexibility. They were just all about sort of lost in optimism, and they did not have the capacity to sort of be present with and accept the brutal reality of what was going on. And so a paradox was named after him. So active coping skills and maintaining a social support network are also key, right? So active coping skills are about incorporating cognitive and behavioral components. So I'm thinking something and I'm acting on it. I'm using my thoughts and my capacity to act to create a set of coping skills for myself. And resilient individuals are generally people who are using active rather than passive coping skills rather. So the active one is I'm feeling stressed, I'm feeling anxious, I'm going to get up and I'm going to run around the block for half an hour until I feel better. The passive coping skill, I'm feeling anxious, I'm feeling stressed, I'm going to curl up in a ball, put a blanket over my head and hope it all passes, right? So the resilient individuals are the ones who generally create their own well-being by engaging in some kind of activity. They act and they create their own resilience and therefore their own well-being. So again, the cognitive component, this is really about being mindful of the thoughts regarding the situation you find yourself in. So you're conscious that you're being present with it. You're not falling into the cloud of avoidance and denial. You're not sort of looking away. You're sort of taking yourself there and being present with what's going on. You're not minimizing the threat. You're not denying it, but you're also not overblowing it. You're also not embellishing it. You're not catastrophizing. You're not awfulizing so that you become consumed by the fear. So you're saying, you're sort of being the arbiter of your own emotions by being present with something, but not allowing yourself to be sort of drawn into the fear of it, right? And we've talked about this also in other parts of our class. So again, resilient individuals act and create their own resilience. They're active, they do something, and through this process, they're creating their own resilience. Right? They're making a conscious choice to do this. This is about the cognitive component. And that cognitive component, again, is being mindful of the thoughts about the situation. I am here. This is what's going on. I am not trying to deny the threat, but I'm also not trying to embellish or blow it up. I'm not trying to get myself to be consumed by it. I'm not denying that it exists. I'm not suggesting that all is going to be fine when it's not, but I'm also not fanning my own fire and making it worse and making it hotter. So, creating positive statements about oneself and one's situation and seeking help and support of others, this combination pack is really the behavioral or action-oriented components that are key to our resilience and our well-being and our capacity to sort of rise up and beyond a traumatic event. And all of this is associated with another important factor in the creation of well-being, and this is about this idea of establishing and nurturing a social support network. Very few of us can go it alone. For the most part, most people need social supports. These are invaluable. In fact, most of the time they're essential. And so you recall several classes ago when we looked at the self and the self in relation, this is really about being able to be in good relation with ourselves and being in good relation with others. Because we are social creatures, we need all of this stuff. When it comes to extraordinary circumstances, traumatic circumstances, extraordinary adversity, our capacity to be in good relation is key, right? We really do need to have social supports. We need to have social supports that are mutually beneficial, and it really is essential to that idea of moving beyond trauma, moving beyond an adverse event, and getting to the place where we can recover from it. We know for sure that there's a whole lot of emotional strength that we accumulate through close relationships and through our associations with organizations. So one of the examples we talked about earlier in our class was this idea of sort of the bit by bit over time how organized religions have fallen out of favor, and that people have moved away from organized religion, and that for reasons that one could argue are okay and not necessarily a bad thing. But what's problematic about that is that organized religions served a really great purpose for a lot of people for a long time, and that they provided this sense of community, this sense of sort of communal holding that was really, really important. And as people have over time sort of disparaged and tossed aside dogmatically organized religions, they have not they've not put something in place to, I guess, to replace that sense of community that religions provided. So whether you do or you don't support organized religion isn't the point here that I'm trying to make. The point is that they provided a really important mainstay for a lot of people. That sense of community, that sense of belonging, that sense of holding, emotional holding in times, especially in times that were really, really difficult. And so, you know, movements toward greater independence and away from sort of more paternalistic bodies that are about that more dogmatic bodies are more paternalistic, which is part of the reason why some of the organized religions have fallen out of favor. All of that aside, if we have not replaced those with that fundamentally important sense of community, I think we've done ourselves a real disservice. So that's something that's really, really lacking. Where not so long ago, people could turn to their church or to their temple, to their mosque, to their whatever, to find a sense of faith, to find a sense of holding, and we don't have that to the same degree that we still have. So, important to note when we're looking at this idea of social support is that there are several sort of trends, several ways of being, several ways we have evolved or changed as a species that have chipped away at social support. So, close relationships, it's not unheard of now to go to a restaurant or to go out with friends or to go somewhere and people have their phones out. And so the countless number of times I've been out and I've seen people sitting at a table together and they're not talking with each other, but they're looking on their phones. So technology, while it's great, certainly has chipped away at capacity to be in close relation. And again, back to the idea of social support from organizations, that for years the primary support from organization were, houses of worship, as it were. And for the most part, we have not done a great job as we've transitioned through times where we're more reliant on technology and we're less reliant on things like organized religion. We haven't done a great job of saying, okay, well, what now? What am I going to replace these with? So in some ways, social support in times of trauma and adversity, now we have to be even more conscious about reaching out and creating those, because some of the prior stand-ins that we would have, we don't have to the same degree anymore. So in some ways, as a species, we're more vulnerable than we were, say, even 10 years ago. So these social supports, be they through close relationships or organizations, give us a perception of an available safety net. They enable us to act in your own interest when confronting or recovering from a stressful or traumatic situation. And it's really, really key. Really, this is about saying somebody has my back, something has my back. And when we think about that, when we sort of look behind and say, hey, nobody has my back, there isn't somebody or some group that I can fall to, then we feel more vulnerable. And if we feel more vulnerable, going into a traumatic situation or we find ourselves in a traumatic situation, then our chances of being able to reframe our thinking and to sort of say, how am I going to get myself through this, become somewhat diminished. So again, when we want to look at this idea, am I going to come out of this with a post-traumatic stress response, or am I going to come out of this as a thriver who's sort of grown beyond it? This sense of safety net, this idea of having either individual relationships or community relationships that are close, that we know of as we recognize as somebody has our back, that's really, really key to how we're going to cope when we're in that trauma. So stay tuned. Part 2 is coming up soon.